I'm going to give the call to the Honourable Alison Xamon and welcome her back to this chamber, and remind members again that this is the inaugural speech of the Honourable Alison Xamon, and so we will all listen in silence to her.
Thank you, Madam President, and congratulations on your appointment as the first woman president in the Legislative Council. But as I was saying, members, before I was so rudely interrupted, it's been 4 years since I last had the opportunity to speak in this place. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that this parliament is meeting on the lands of the Whadjuk people, a proud people who have been the custodians of this country for tens of thousands of years and who, despite a history of violent colonisation, have a strong culture which has survived. I acknowledge that ownership of this land was never ceded and that this is and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that it's beholden on myself and indeed all of us in this place to ensure that our decisions work towards ensuring justice for Aboriginal people and to addressing the ongoing impacts of colonisation and racism. So, Madam President, over the last 4 years, much has changed, and yet much has not. And I do have plenty of things to say about a great many things, but I'm just going to touch on some of my favourite topics tonight. I'm really pleased that the Greens have reclaimed our seat in the North Metropolitan Region, a seat which was held by my friend and former colleague, the Honourable Giz Watson, so capably for 15 years. And for those members who have not worked with me before, a podded version, a very small version about who I am. If you want to know more about me, you can of course read my original inaugural speech, or indeed any of the hundreds of speeches I gave when I was last in this place during the 38th Parliament. I'm sure you will find it absolutely riveting reading. I am born and bred from Perth, and I've lived here my whole life except for a couple of years when I was a toddler and my family lived in Merredin. I'm the daughter of a Uniting Church minister and my mother was originally a teacher. My life changed irreversibly and absolutely for the worst when I was 11 years old and my dearly loved father lost his battle with depression and chose to take his life. This experience rocked me and my family and my world, and none of us ever fully recovered, and the ensuing fallout was enormous and has defined much of what I now do with my life. I do feel like I have lived many lives and have had to overcome a fair amount of subsequent adversity, but it's always my hope that these experiences assist me in becoming a better advocate for people whose lives are not easy or simple or have been adversely affected by trauma. I hope to be someone who reflects what recovery from profound unwellness can look like. In my 20s, I became a sole parent to my wonderful daughter, and my life began to turn around, and a couple of years later I met the man who would go on to become my now husband and the father to our 2 sons. From a career perspective, I started off as a qualified play leader working with children at risk after graduating with a Cert 4 from TAFE, which I didn't have to pay for, by the way, and eventually made my way to the union movement where I worked as an organiser, industrial officer, equal opportunity specialist and also a lawyer, picking up 2 university degrees and admission to the Supreme Court along the way. I'm really proud of my union background, often considered a bit of an unusual one for a Greens member. But it was my job to uphold the human rights of workers, and I think that's a pretty honourable way to earn a living. And then I was elected to sit in the 38th Parliament, but I wasn't elected to the 39th. And for the past 4 years, I've been immersed in mental health and suicide prevention advocacy, also working with prisoners, disability advocates and continuing my legal work, including working with refugees. I note that when I was working with refugees, it was meant to be my respite from the mental health and suicide work that I was undertaking simultaneously. Unfortunately, I can assure members that the way we currently treat those who arrive at our shores who are seeking protection from terror and persecution ensured that there was no chance that I would be working with a clientele unaffected by the impact of mental illness and suicide. To be plain, our detention centres produce a level of despair, misery and hopelessness for our fellow humans who are already suffering from losing so much and having experienced so much trauma. As such, the way we treat refugees and asylum seekers who arrive in Australia should be a source of great national shame, and I believe that history is going to judge us poorly. Members are going to hear me talk a lot about the issue of mental health. It's one of my key concerns and a core part of my life's work. I don't believe that the issue of mental health is one which belongs to any one party. I firmly believe that champions for mental health can be found right across the political spectrum, and likewise governments of all persuasions can also be held responsible for the legacy of chronic underfunding and neglect that the mental health sector has traditionally experienced Australia-wide for decades. But I do want to start by acknowledging and commenting on some of the positive reforms which have occurred within Western Australia over recent years, and to give credit where credit's due. These reforms, which have been long lobbied for and have been at the instigation of the mental health sector, were enacted under the Barnett government, and it's important to acknowledge when things are done well. There were many positive structural reforms that have begun to turn around what's happening with mental health. The first thing is we finally established a separate mental health ministry. This was a positive thing because it meant for the first time mental health within the spectrum of health was able to get the individual attention which it so desperately required. For too long, the needs of people with mental health issues were left to become secondary to the pressing issues surrounding health. But by having an independent mental health minister, it meant that we were finally able to focus attention and reform in this very important space. I know that when this Labor government made the decision to put those two ministries under one minister, that there was concern about that from the mental health sector. And yet at the same time, perhaps it's an opportunity. I'm prepared to keep an open mind to this. I think it's really important that we maintain two independent separate ministries, but maybe there is opportunity to be able to ensure that there is genuine structural change within the health department about the way they respond to mental health issues at all. But I can be very clear in this place that if I feel that mental health once again is going to be taking a backwards slide, I'm going to be the first one in this place who's going to be drawing it to everybody's attention. It won't be happening on my watch. Another really important reform was the establishment of a commissioning mental health commission. I don't think people should understate how important a reform that is. Now, we in WA are still the only state which has a mental health commission with the power to procure services, and that is enormously important. And I know from the work that I have done, particularly nationally, that we are the envy of many states in terms of the capacity for our mental health commission to effect real change. For other mental health commissions in other states, they work really hard on developing great policies. They work really hard on trying to put forward proposals. But frankly, power in mental health is always going to be with whoever has the dollar. And so it is very, very important that we have got an independent planning commission that can develop the policy, preferably, in fact, I would say necessarily in conjunction with people with lived experience, and then have the dollars to be able to purchase what is required in order to achieve reform. I'm going to note that when the Labor government made the decision to combine a whole range of government departments, the decision was made to stick with the previous government, the commitment which was made in opposition to keep a separate mental health commission. I commend the government for doing that, and I'm going to insist that the government do not backtrack on that at any point in the future. I know that there is pressure coming to bear, particularly from some large doctors' organisations who might feel very strongly about the need to get rid of the Mental Health Commission. But I believe that this would be absolutely a step backwards, and it's very important that we ensure that the Mental Health Commission is able to retain its full power and is able to ensure that services are still able to be purchased as part of what it does. So, we also recognised the importance of ensuring that the voice of lived experience, those people who live with mental illness, who use the services, their carers and their family members, are put at the centre of not only why we provide mental health services, but ensuring that the voice of lived experience designs the very services that are provided. This is the way that it needs to be within mental health. Nobody knows better what they need for their own mental health than the person who is struggling themselves. The power of co-production cannot be understated. You can have the wisdom of people with the clinical experience and the know-how, along with the people who are living through that experience. And this has been transformational in terms of how we now address mental health services and how we see that mental health services need to be developed going into the future. I also want to commend the decision that was made to fund systemic advocacy. This is something that the mental health sector has been able to ensure was ongoing, that has not been enjoyed in other sectors, and I'm going to get to that later on. The reason this is so important is because it ensures that the voice of lived experience and the voice of working in conjunction with the voice of service providers and also clinicians is able to be heard in order to effect real changes. The one thing we want to ensure is that real change within mental health is not something that degenerates into party politics. We want to make sure that we are able to effect genuine change, and part of the way you do this is that you do ensure that those organisations in particular who can best incorporate that voice, who can best analyse what needs to occur, are able to do that. If you decide to gut systemic advocacy, you are effectively making a decision to silence people who are best placed to be able to tell us what we need to do in order to ensure that we are making the best reforms we can. We now understand the notion of recovery and the need to work within trauma-informed frameworks. I think this has become more mainstream and people recognise this. The wonderful thing about recovery is that it acknowledges that people can and do get better, that with the right supports, with the right services, and with the right understanding within the community, that people can live good lives. I want to acknowledge the importance of the fact that we finally have a new Mental Health Act. It isn't perfect. We are going to need to do a proper in-depth review. But the thing is, we always knew we were going to have to do that because it was such an overwhelmingly transformational piece of legislation that you're never going to have a piece of legislation that large implemented without having problems. I'm going to say that one of the key problems with the implementation of the new Mental Health Act has been the lack of practical support to be able to enable to implement it. In particular, the lack of investment that has gone into ensuring electronic systems which would enable us to best enact the provisions of this Act. Now, this is an ongoing problem. I'm sure if I start talking about the Health Department and IT systems that I will not be an orphan in this place in terms of recognising what a huge problem we have. But I think that it's also important people know that when it comes to pieces of legislation like the Mental Health Act, which of course has the potential to rob people of their authority, that it's especially important that we are mindful of needing to ensure that we are providing the best possible support to enable it to be implemented. But I also want to acknowledge and thank those clinicians who have taken on board the new provisions so well and have worked so hard and are really trying to embrace the new provisions and trying to do the right thing despite not getting enough support. And of course, a big thing that's occurred has been the introduction of the 10-year services plan for mental health, which also incorporates alcohol and other drug services. I really hope that this place makes a decision across all party lines to embrace this particular plan and to ensure that it is implemented and that we stick to the timelines implemented within the plan as far as practicable. The principal thing that this plan does is it recognises that in order to stop the sheer number of people that end up in our acute and subacute systems within the mental health system, that we need to start looking at investment in prevention and early intervention services and how absolutely critical this is. Now, most of these services are going to be successfully provided by the community managed mental health sector. And I'm disappointed that since the plan came into effect, that we have still looked at putting most of our investment into the acute and subacute areas rather than looking at what we term turning off the tap. So stopping the situation where people are getting so unwell that they end up in the most expensive delivery of services, which is acute and subacute. And that's without even looking at the human impact of what happens for those people and those families. It's really important that we start looking at genuine investment. I am the first one in this place to know that we don't have a lot of money. But what I also know is that if we don't start investing in early intervention and prevention services, it's just going to cost this state, and that's without us talking about the human cost, so much more, millions and millions and more in the long run. Because treating people once they've got to that point of just being so critically ill, rather than assisting people early on when they start to experiencing mental health distress, is just bad economic sense. Now, the plan's not perfect. There was some intervention by Cabinet with a few provisions, and I suspect that that may be the subject of discussion at various points, but generally it is really, really sound. And so I'm going to ask people, anyone who has an interest, to go away and look at it, because it also outlines the need for specialised services in this state for a whole range of people. I also want to note the establishment of the Mental Health Court, or the START Court as we refer to it, which is a really important intervention for those people who are experiencing mental health issues and getting into early trouble with the law. It's an enormous success. It's the success rate for this program is on the record. It's turning people's lives around, it's steering people away from the justice system and saving us money in the long run. It's a very, very important provision. We need to look at expanding it so that it goes out into the regions. We need to look at expanding the services which are attached to this, which are available to our children, to the Children's Court as well. But I also want to acknowledge the specialist services which have been established, like the statewide Aboriginal Mental Health Service. I hope that continues. We've seen specialist services around eating disorders, for example, be established, about time. And so we are starting to go in the right direction. So that's the good news. We also saw the establishment of the Mental Health Network. And I was lucky enough to be appointed to be one of the co-leads for the statewide mental health network. This is a very important initiative of the Department of Health. And what it does is it brings multidisciplinary clinicians, so psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, peer workers, nurses, and as well as people with lived experience, as well as primary health providers, as well as community managed mental health services together in order to develop models of care, models of service, clinical guidelines. It's genuine co-production, and it meant that we were able to harness the expertise of an enormous number of people. There are literally thousands of people involved with this network in order to effect reform. But I am going to note, I'm very disappointed that that network has failed to attract the level of support that it requires from the Health Department in order to succeed. It is co-run with the Mental Health Commission, and the Mental Health Commission has been pretty fulsome in its support, but we're not seeing that at the moment with the Health Department. And I really hope that that gets turned around, because it's an absolute mistake to allow something as important as the mental health network to not achieve the extent of what it can achieve. But what hasn't happened? Well, the first thing that I'm going to talk about, because I banged on about it for 4 years when I was here before, and I've been banging on it for the last 4 years, is what has not happened with the Criminal Law Mentally Impaired Accused Act, and I'm really angry about it. The Criminal Law Mentally Impaired Accused Act, as I said earlier on today in this place, is a heinous piece of legislation. It is diabolical. The United Nations has recognised that it breaches the human rights of people with disability. It is a great disgrace that this state still has it on its books. It came into effect in 1996. And as early as 2003, through the Holman Review, it was recognised that we needed to drastically transform this piece of legislation. It has left vulnerable people with mental impairment, people with mental illness, people with intellectual disability, cognitive disability, senility, acquired brain injury, rotting in our jails, people who have not been afforded the right to be able to have their day in court. We saw the case of Marlon Noble, which people who were here before would know was one of the people that I advocated for and for his release, left to rot in jail for 10 years, only to find that eventually the charges got dropped. He still remains on a custody order to this day. He is not facing charges anymore. He never got a chance to have his day in court, and he's still on a custody order. It is an absolute diabolical disgrace. There are some really fundamentals that need to occur. I believe that we need to make sure, as a matter of urgency, that we are reforming key provisions within this Act. But then I believe we also need to, in consultation with the mental health and disability sectors, who are the people who best know, look at a complete rewrite of an entirely new piece of legislation so that we can achieve the policy outcomes that was originally envisaged when this Act was created, which was to take people with mental impairment who come up against the justice system and allow them therapeutic options to get the services, to get the support they need so they no longer engage in offending behaviours. We are talking about incredibly vulnerable people who, by the very nature of their mental impairment, are not intending to commit offences against anybody. There are some key provisions that we have to get in, and I really hope that when we finally see an amended CLIMIA in this place, that there are at least 5 provisions which have been urgently addressed. And I'm calling on the Attorney-General to make sure that all 5 of these, at a bare minimum, get included. And the first thing is that we need to make sure that there is a final limitation of terms so that nobody who is held on a custody order under this Act is ever able to be left in prison for any longer than they would be had they been found guilty of the original offence. The second thing is we need to allow a special hearing. We need to allow, even before people get to the point of being incarcerated, to allow the evidence to be tested to see whether there's even a case to answer in the first place. It happens in other states. There's no reason in the world why we can't have that here. There's a whole range of procedural fairness provisions we need to have. There's no right of appeal under this Act. No right of appeal. We need to ensure that we are removing politics out of the decisions and making sure that a decision to release people from a custody order is put in the hands of the judiciary and taken away from politicians to make those decisions. That is surely a fundamental principle of justice. But I think probably one of the biggest things that certainly our Supreme Court judges have been calling for is that we need to ensure that people have a range of options, that there is judicial discretion for a range of options. At the moment, if someone is deemed to be mentally impaired accused, a judge is faced with 2 options, either just release or put in prison potentially indefinitely. And our magistrates and our judges are screaming out for the option to be made available that they can take vulnerable people and have a middle road, and that is to put them on some sort of order which enables them to live in the community with appropriate services so that they can allow people who have often fallen through the cracks, particularly people with disability, to ensure that they finally get the services that they need. It is absolutely ludicrous that we don't have these basic provisions. So that is an issue that is one of the key issues why I basically needed to come back into this place. I felt I needed to, because that didn't get resolved in the last 4 years, and we have been begging for reform on this. I recognise that it's not a politically popular decision to take. Seriously, so go out to the general public and say, I am fighting for the human rights of people with disability who engage in offending behaviours. People hate it. They absolutely hate it. But we have to take it on. For once, let's actually do what's the right thing. Let's talk about human rights, and let's just not go down the cowardly populist line. So I'm hoping that we get this addressed. I hope we get it addressed early on in this parliament so that it doesn't become some hideous political issue going into an election, but let's get it finally reformed. I also want to make reference to other issues within mental health. I'm hoping that we're going to finally see the establishment of recovery colleges in this place. I note that there has been some commitment by this government to establishing recovery colleges. I'm going to put forward a word of caution. I've had the privilege of seeing many recovery colleges, both overseas and also around Australia, and a recovery college and a recovery college are not necessarily the same thing. They're a whole bunch of different models, and what I'm going to say is we have a committed group of people in this state of lived experience and service providers and advocates who have been working towards a model model for many, many years. They know the sort of model that has been agreed within the sector, and the one thing I would encourage this government to do before they proceed on any idea for a recovery college is make sure that they are taking clear direction from these people as to what is required, because otherwise you're effectively bypassing good co-production, and that would be utterly counterproductive. If we do have a recovery college or even recovery colleges of an agreed model within this state, it can be transformational for people with mental illness. I also want to say I'm really looking forward to the day when we have a proper transcultural mental health unit for people of various cultural backgrounds. We did have a semblance of one that was run out of the health department, but I'm not going to pretend for 1 second that it really is any sort of service at all. We need to have a proper statewide service that can provide appropriate levels of services, and for that matter, we need a range of specialist services for people with personality disorder, for example. The number of people with personality disorder who turn up in crisis to our acute settings, who end up being turned away and who go on to take their lives is an absolute travesty. We need to ensure we start looking at specialised services for this very complex area of mental health. I remain concerned about what's going to happen with what we term Tier 2 services for those people with psychosocial disability or mental health issues who are not going to be eligible for the NDIS, who don't quite meet the criteria but who need to make sure that they get services. We're going to have to make sure they keep getting funded, because guess what's going to happen? Otherwise they're going to get critically unwell and they're going to need to go into NDIS. So we need to make sure we are keeping that level of service going. We have to do something about what's happened with our private psychiatric hostels. Some of them are amazing and try really hard to provide an incredible home-like environment despite having absolutely no money. But I've walked into psychiatric hostels which I believe fundamentally breach people's human rights. I've walked in to psychiatric hostels which look clean and they smell like disinfectant, and the people who live there are so drugged up, it's like I'm walking into the living dead. And it is absolutely devastating and absolutely heartbreaking. That shouldn't be allowed to happen in this day and age. And we need to look at how we can drastically reform this space. And by that, can I be really clear, I am not talking about closing down these hostels overnight, because what will happen is these people will be left on the streets. They will be left homeless. And we are talking about generations of people who have come from institutions straight into psychiatric hostels, have long lost contact with their family. These are their homes now, and this is what they need. But we need to be able to do it better, and we don't. Obviously, we need services in the region. I congratulate the previous government for establishing telehealth, which I understand was an initiative that came from Royalties for Regions. It has been a very important initiative and has helped enormously to allow people in our regions to be able to access services. So I think it's going to be really important that we don't lose that particular reform, and we always need to look at expanding that even further, particularly as we now have legislation like the Mental Health Act, which effectively relies on its existence. So that's something that's particularly important. Okay, Aboriginal mental health. Well, we've got the statewide Aboriginal Mental Health Service, which is great, but we do not have the services out in the regions that we need. And I think if there was one thing I would say, I would really like the federal government to get out of this space. I would like them to just hand the money over to the state and let us organise this, because one of the problems we've got in terms of Aboriginal mental health and indeed suicide prevention is that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and there's so much crossover and there are so many gaps, and it is such a problem, and we need to get the governance around this right, because at the end of the day it is people who are suffering because we don't have it right. I'm really glad that the Mental Health Commission is continuing to progress work on the accommodation strategy for people with mental health issues, but it's going to require money. What we know is that safe and secure accommodation and housing is one of the key social determinants for people's mental health. And so we're going to have to ensure that we find better ways to enable people to be appropriately housed, particularly at the acute end when people are being discharged from places like Greenlands. There needs to be appropriate accommodation for people to go into. So we're going to have to start learning to work across sectors. The housing department is going to have to learn to work with the Mental Health Commission and a whole range of other areas, and yet we just don't do it well. We need to have investment in forensic services. I think the time frame on that in the mental health plan is all wrong. We've got the same number of beds for forensic services that we had decades ago, and we don't have enough, and it is a problem. And it's becoming more of a problem with the ice epidemic. So we have an acute problem that needs to get addressed. And finally, I think that the key area that is often left to the feds to deal with, but I'm going to still keep raising it at a state level, is we need to look at support services for people with mental illness who want to go into employment. Occupation, employment, keeping busy is another social determinant for mental health, and it is an area that we don't invest enough in, and so I'm really hoping that we start being able to encourage people to work, because I firmly believe that when people work, they not only have a purpose, they not only have an income, but they have a sense of citizenship, and that's critically important. So it's been interesting noting what's been happening with the health department. I'm going to say that one of the things that came out of the Stokes review following a series of suicides was the need to ensure that we had consistency of service across the state. And I'm going to note that the decision that was made by this previous government to split us into 4 different regions and to move to boards was not necessarily consistent with ensuring that we have got the capacity to ensure a consistent service across the state in either mental health or indeed health services, and I'm really concerned about that. Added to that is I'm going to reflect that Royal Street seems to have a fair bit of confusion as to what it means to be the system manager in this new regime. We need statewide policies, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite to develop them. We need lots of them. That's how we ensure that even though we have the boards that are running the show at the local level, that no matter where you live, you can ensure that you will have a consistency of service to access either mental health or health services, and you don't have it at the moment. We need to remove the postcode lottery when people are trying to access these services. And likewise, we need to be looking at early intervention in the same way as we are with mental health, with health. You know, we need to look at early intervention and prevention to avoid stroke and heart disease and cancer. So these are issues that we end up paying top dollar for once people are at the point of being critically ill. And yet we know what the solutions are to stop people from getting that unwell in the first place. But it's really hard to justify dollars for that when you've got people screaming for acute services. I recognise that. We're going to have to find a way to start doing it better. And I thought I might just add, it was an issue that has been brought to my attention previously, but I've decided I want to raise it specifically. I won't usually concentrate on specific issues, but I do want to raise the issue of Lyme disease as well. because it has been brought to my attention a number of times. And in fact, I have, they wouldn't know it, but I have two people in the galleries listening right now who don't know each other, who both have independently spoken to me about this issue. I recognise it's complex, and I recognise that we still need to do more research into this area. But people who are experiencing Lyme disease or the Australian equivalent of Lyme disease, if that's indeed what it is, are really struggling. They're struggling because they're effectively being told that their illness doesn't exist when it does, and because it means they're not able to get the support that they need. So I'm flagging that that's an issue that I'm wanting to raise in this place, because I have to say, if you have experienced chronic fatigue or any of those sorts of debilitative illnesses, it really, really, really messes with your life. I'm going to channel my inner former member here, on the Honourable Linda Savage, in talking about the need for child health centres. She is a former member in this place, a member of the Labor Party in the 38th Parliament, who did an enormous amount of work, and I'm proud to say that I've continued to be able to work with her around the issue of the need for early intervention for children. It is so easily overlooked, and yet it's so important to be able to make sure that you are ensuring that children from the very earliest stages are having issues addressed before they become too much of a problem. I experienced this myself with my youngest son, and it meant that he didn't speak till far too late. But suicide. I was really fortunate to have been appointed to the Ministerial Council for Suicide Prevention, and I want to thank the previous government for enabling me to do that. Together, this group of people from a wide political persuasions and a lot of background and lived experience helped to advise on a whole range of areas around suicide prevention. We have seen significant investment, but I'm going to suggest that we still have so far to go. We know that we have got shameful rates of Aboriginal suicide. We know that particularly young people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, people who identify as queer and who are subject to homophobia and transphobia, are at higher rates a higher risk of suicide, and we need to address this. It's a matter of urgency. I'm very concerned about the older Australians who are increasingly looking to suicide, and what does that mean in terms of isolation and lack of services and the value that we are putting on older people's lives. And I say the same thing for people with disability. People with disability who choose to take their own life because they just don't feel valued, because they cannot get the services they need to live a quality life. This is deeply concerning. But in particular, I do want to acknowledge how relieved I am that we were able to get a service up for children who have been bereaved by suicide. Children who have been bereaved by suicide are themselves 3 times more likely to take their life earlier or later on in life, and are at huge risk of going on to have mental health issues. It is a pilot program here in this state. It is already inundated with demand. They cannot keep up with the need, and it is one that I'll be keeping a very close eye on, because it is so critically important. I'm looking forward to working with the disability community. I've already in this place started asking some questions about NDIS. I don't know whether we need to go with a state system or whether we need to go with a federal system. I think that there are problems with both, and there are merits to both. And I think in many ways it's not even up to me to make that decision. It is up to people with disability to be making that decision. And the one thing I'm asking is that whichever way we go, we need to make sure that it is people with disability who are helping to design what the system is, who are involved with renegotiating their bilateral agreements, who are able to say what it is that they think it needs to be. There's a huge amount of uncertainty around at the moment, and people are distressed because the NDIS was a hard-fought-for reform, and people are really desperately concerned that they're going to lose this. I also note with interest the decision to dissolve the Disability Services Commission into another department. And I'm going to say I've got mixed feelings on this. I'm sad because I think we do need a separate Disability Services Commission, because we need to look at ways that we can ensure that disability has the particular focus that it requires in the same way that mental health does. But at the same time, I'm going to acknowledge that for many people with disability, they felt like the Disability Services Commission had lost its way. And so there hasn't been a huge amount of sorrow over what's happened. That's not a slight on the wonderful people that are working in there, because there are some really dedicated people in there, but it is a recognition that it has been a problem. We've got lots to do around ensuring we've got accessibility for transport, that for people with disability, that our planning laws are better reflective of accessibility requirements, and as well as our housing laws. We need to ensure, again, that we're investing in services around employment. We need to look at the issue of seclusion and restraint and how they're used in our schools. And we need to, again, look at the issue of systemic advocacy. It was appalling that a decision was made to defund those disability organisations who engage in systemic advocacy. We need to have organisations who can provide that clear, coherent voice to ensure that all reforms and policies are going to have the best possible impact they can for people with disability, and it was a mistake. We need to be able to ensure that we are doing everything we can to uphold the human rights and indeed the valued citizenship of people with disability. I'm going to note that we also need to look at making sure we're investing properly in our alcohol and other drug services. Again, I'm going to draw your attention back to the 10-year services plan, which outlines what it is that we need, but we must look at a different approach to the way we're dealing with the issue of alcohol and other drugs. It is pointless trying to stick people into prisons if they are simply people who are caught up in the cycle of drug abuse. We need to be treating this as a critical health issue and ensuring that people are getting support. People's lives are being ruined and families are being destroyed because they're simply not able to get the support that they need. And our prisons are no place for anybody. I've been working in the prisons, and the training facilities are absolutely substandard. They're not preparing people to do anything. The mental health services are virtually non-existent. The health services are virtually non-existent. And one of the things I'm hoping that this place will do will unite to say that we need to ensure that Medicare is provided within our prisons. That should not be sitting on our shoulders. That should be part of the general scheme of what happens in terms of the providing of health funding. There's no dental. There's virtually no alcohol and other drug services, and people are needing basic legal services as well. That, people don't understand, how to do things around tenancy and really basic things that would assist people to keep out. I commend the previous government for the establishment of the Disability Justice Centre. It was really needed. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. And I condemn those people who ran the vile, bigoted campaign against the Disability Justice Centre, which created so much distress for people within the disability sector and was so unnecessary. It's really important that we have places like this to enable people to not be stuck in our prisons. This is going to be more of an issue as we go on, particularly as we have more and more people who are diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. Our approach to law and order is populist and ill thought out and knee-jerk. It's not making for safer communities. All it's ensuring is that justice is not being served. I am despairing about the mad rush towards desecration of the rule of law. Mandatory sentencing is a blight, and it should not happen. We need to ensure that we have got judicial discretion. We have got challenges to the right to silence. We're seeing the reversal of the onus of proof, and it's really important that these are challenged and that we're not able to lose the rule of law, which is so fundamental to ensuring that we are able to achieve justice. I shout out for community services who provide so many important services, and I want to say how disappointed I am at what's happening in terms of the cutting back of so many of our essential public services as well. And I'm going to have more to say about that, but because I'm running out of time, I'm going to focus on some other key issues that are important to me. I want to talk about how angry I am about what's happened to WorkSafe over the previous government. We have lost staff, we have lost outsourced expertise. There is a culture within WorkSafe of not going out and checking out workplaces and ensuring that we have the safest workplaces that we can have to the degree that I believe that we need to. We need to make sure we have finally got uniform occupational health and safety laws. We have some of the worst OSH laws in this country, and really how that can happen is beyond me. So we should be looking at making sure that not only do we finally adopt the uniform laws, but we should be looking at improving them as well. And that because there are real concerns which keep getting raised with me around apprenticeship safety and what is happening. We are losing fundamental safety regimes. People in this place may be aware of my desire to ensure that we are introducing legislation around industrial manslaughter. I think that is a really critical addition to the criminal code. I firmly believe that if you are an employer and if you make a decision which you know could reasonably result in somebody's death and somebody dies as a result, you deserve to go to prison. These are the people that should be in our prisons, not people who are caught up with petty drug issues like possession, who need to get support. But we need to start getting serious about worker safety. We spend too much time focusing on the carrot, and I'm saying about time that we employ a little bit of the stick. I also want to say that I'm very disappointed as to what's happened to TAFE. As I said before, I managed to go to TAFE and it helped me to get to my first job, but it is simply unaffordable for too many people. And we shouldn't be putting any barriers like that in the way of people being able to retrain and get employment. It is particularly important in this post-mining world where we need to ensure that people are able to get every opportunity they can to get work. I'll be saying much in this place around electoral affairs, around the need to change our voting tickets and to look at reform. But also, I think for integrity of government, we need to start looking at donations reform. We need to look at restrictions on lobbyists' access to ministers. We need to make sure that people are not able to buy their way into influence within this place. Everybody deserves to be able to feel that they can access their Member of Parliament without worrying about whether they have enough money to be able to do that. I'm also going to be very supportive of changes around whistleblowers, while at the same time making sure that we don't allow whistleblower legislation to be used by cowards to be able to make vexatious allegations in order to pursue personal agendas. That's pretty important. But I'm also going to say I'm going to be continuing to talk about climate change. It is one of the key areas that it is unbelievable that we're not doing everything we can. Can I say if today's paper showed that we might have the Wacker subsumed by the river, and if that is not case for a national emergency, I don't know what is. So can we finally do something about this? And uranium's not the solution. It is dirty. If anyone here has the solution to how we can make sure we can store radioactive waste for tens of thousands of years safely, please speak up, because you'll be the only person in the world who knows. We have a responsibility to future generations not to go there, and the uranium mining itself is displacing Aboriginal people. Likewise, fracking's not a solution. Okay, farmers hate it, and I don't blame them. It does put our water sources at risk, but more than anything, it just continues the endless cycle of using fossil fuels, which just stands in the way of us being able to make the transition to a jobs-rich future in renewable energy. We talk about it ad infinitum, and yet we need to finally start making that transition. But in terms of a vision for a more positive future, I'm a huge fan of public transport, particularly rail and light rail and placemaking opportunities it provides. We can design our cities better than we do. Housing which is sustainable, has an appropriate mix of private ownership and low-income housing. Housing which is designed to passively heat and cool our homes, where the use of PV and the now emergent use of battery storage becomes the norm. Housing which makes better use of our precious water, including water capture, third pipe systems, systems and also water saving and recycling technologies, housing which is accessible for older people or people with disability. We need to preserve what's remaining of our urban bushland. The Swan Coastal Plain is a biodiversity hotspot, and yet I'm concerned at how many people don't even understand what that means. To be a biodiversity hotspot is not a good thing. It basically means that we have a region where it's acknowledged that we have a level of biodiversity that's under threat. And at this point, I have to say something about the farce of offsets. If you wipe out one type of vegetation in order to preserve a completely different type of vegetation, you have completely missed the point. We've only got pockets of urban bushland left, and they are home to wildlife, and they provide cool to our cities and amenity, and yet they're under constant threat of inappropriate developments. So kudos to those local government areas that have made the effort to preserve their local bushlands, but most of our urban bushland remains unprotected, and we need to do something about that. Now, look, I'm aware that the vision I've described is very urban-based, and it's a formula for how large groups of people can live together. But I also acknowledge the need for people in our rural and remote regions to also have access to sustainable technology as a form of affordable housing and services. And I think in particular the need to ensure that our Aboriginal communities are given the resources and the governance opportunities to ensure that their communities are not only able to stay open, but to thrive. I understand that to take Aboriginal people from country is to effectively kill them. We should be doing all we can to ensure that our actions do not sever this connection, that we ensure that current and future generations of Aboriginal communities are supported. But, Mr. Deputy President, I have many people to thank for enabling me to be back in this place. It was the Greens who've placed their trust in me, and the Greens to whom I owe my gratitude. Of course, I thank all those who voted for the Greens in North Metro. I thank those members and supporters who door-knocked and phone-banked and leafleted and who stood on stalls and who staffed polling booths. These are people who gave of their time and energy because they put their hope and trust in the Greens to advocate for a kinder, gentler, cleaner, safer, sustainable and for a better future. So I thank those people who ran the Greens statewide election campaign. But I particularly thank those who are part of Team North Metro, who volunteered and worked so very, very hard, who had my back and who looked out for and supported each other. So special thanks to the North Metro candidates Sam Jenkinson and Ziggy Fatnana, who joined me on the North Metro Upper House ticket. And then the amazingly talented Lower House crew, Nicole Harvey, Mark Cooper, Tom Webster, Nadine Reeves-Hennessy, Joe Gurak, Greg Boland, Mushfiq Shah, Luana Lloyd, Lisa Webb, Matt Ward, Dan Grosso, Hannah Milligan, Jude Cullity and Robin Treacy. In addition to my candidates, I want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of Jordan Gibbs, Andrew Woolley, Patrick Hislop, Sebastian Tudor, Anne-Marie Hindinger, Louis Marchant, Graham Hanson, Caitlin O'Day, Lisa Thornton, Sheila Bulbeck, Cadell Annan, Claire McCormick and Dan Loden. And the whole North Metro team ran like clockwork because of the leadership and the sheer hard work of Laurel DeVitri, Ben Herman, Andrew Markey and Justin Blanche, and the ongoing support of our party co-conveners Graham Boland and Sarah Nielsen-Harvey. Thank you so much to all of you. I hope to make your efforts worthwhile. I'm looking forward to working with my old colleague, the Honourable Robin Chappell, and being joined by new members, Honourable Tim Clifford and the Honourable Diane Evers, and of course continuing to work with my friends, WA Senators Rachel Seward and Scott Ludlam. But I'm disappointed that I won't be working again with the Honourable Lynn McLaren, and I want to thank her for all her hard work over the last 8 years, and particularly her support during the election campaign. I'm so very pleased that I'm being rejoined by my former staffers, the uber-talented Kirsten and Jocasta, and our team is being joined by the lovely Lee. On a personal note, thank you to all those members of the Uniting Church who've been so loving and supportive. It means the world to me. And I want to thank those people who know me the best and who remain my most precious and loyal of friends, Ali, Taryn, Ramona, Alex, Liz and Mark. I want to also note that this election was particularly hard with the devastating passing of one of my dearest and most special of friends, Mark Newhouse, who lost his battle with cancer in February. Mark would have been known by many of you as the powerhouse behind the Deaths in Custody Watch Committee and numerous human rights and anti-racism campaigns. But to me, he was also my friend, and I loved him, and his death has left a hole in my life. But finally, everything in my life makes sense and has purpose because of my 3 beautiful children, Miette, Jackson and Blake, and my husband, partner and everything, and best friend, Luke Edmonds. You're my world, and I can only ever do what I do because of you. So, Mr. Deputy President, I'm back, and there's much to do, and I know enough to know that I may only get this 4 years. So this is not really my inaugural, this is my address and reply, but let's get cracking because I'm ready to start.
Probably a good time to walk into some TV and that.
Welcome back.